Back in 2017, I did a series called, the We Died in 2012 series. And I didn't know at the time exactly what it was that I was doing because I didn't have the terminology and I didn't have the vocabulary and I really didn't understand what was happening around me in terms of the Mandela effect and all those other things. And as I went through the series, I started to explore different ideas around the central concept, the central thought experiment of what happens in the wake of something that is incredibly traumatic to a large population, and how do they react to something like that? And then taking that idea and just sort of bolting on like a Lego set, different ideas. And eventually I came up with an entirely fictive, or what I thought was an entirely fictive environment around that idea, that central concept of We Died in 2012. The We Died in 2012 concept isn't original. In film and cinema, it's been shown over and over and over again. Um, at the micro level, it would be something like The Sixth Sense. That was a perfect example of someone who was in the afterlife and they didn't know. The Nicole Kidman movie, The Others, as well as Jacob's Ladder. And we can go all the way up into Melancholia, where the world itself is about to end, and how people react whenever they face these kinds of massive kind of changes and stages that they go through. And they talk, and then also too, one of the more important parts is the deep study. And I always went back to like Jacob's Ladder, but more or less I've been thinking about the deep study that was actually happening in The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis and the 5 stages of grief, the grief that he was going through. And eventually you were seeing that played out in the last few minutes of Jacob's Ladder, and as he climbed the stairway with his son. But I didn't know at the time the way in which reality was actually working, and the way it was sort of careening towards this thing, this dissolving consensus, this kind of idea where the entire planet itself is slowly dissolving into this kind of almost kind of a bit of like a symphony of chaos in a way. And I don't know exactly where it's going to end up right now, but I noticed yesterday on my show on the Lizard Ritual on Truth Frequency Radio that I do, um, I recognized three major tracks that were going on with this chaos, this sort of band of chaos that we find in our own individual frequency right now. And right now, not naturally, you have the political tract, and that's almost self-explanatory for anyone that's awake right now on the planet. On the second track, you sort of have this social media thing that's going on, and I think it's sort of a kind of satellite. It's sort of a satellite problem of the original political issues we're dealing with. And then finally, we have something that is causing the largest amount of dissolving consensus, which is almost the daily update now that we have of the UAP, UFO confirmation disclosure process that we have. And it wasn't until yesterday that I realized how powerful some of those ideas that I was putting forth. Now, let me preface this with saying that my ideas alone aren't all that powerful in and of themselves. But what I'm thinking of with this idea is particularly with looking back, and kind of as a retrospective on my work back then, that body of work I did back in 2017, I started to think about the idea of a more malleable reality. And I start to think about it in a more serious and fundamental way of a malleable reality, and one in which an individual can truly, and that can be a heaven or an abyss or somewhere in between. And how does that actually work whenever individuals interact with one another? And, you know, during that process, I obviously, for reasons that I've gone over ad nauseum, I moved away from that and I started to get into deeper Mandela effect kind of things. And finally, we started to get into like hardcore research and started adding people to the team and to the group and to the channel. And we finally came along this document called the Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. And one of the more profound things about this and why it plays so well into the 2017 thing, and it was really Chick that pointed this out to me, my co-host on our Saturday show, The Lost and Found Bin, was that indeed, in a way, my work in 2017 was it was prophetic, but I don't think that makes me special. I think anybody's work that was pointing out something at a particular given time after 2012 is somewhat prophetic. So, I spoke this way, but I didn't really know it until I had the document in my hand. So I'm going to read a little bit from the document here. The consciousness matrix, and that's on page 8. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is, in and of itself, one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. And it goes on to say, the human mind is also a hologram, which attunes itself to the universal hologram by medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving what we call or meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. Naturally, that implies that the durability and the strictness of a linear time construct is already suspect, right? Obviously, we're already you have to put yourself almost in a state of disbelief, like you're watching a movie whenever you read a document like this. I've included the document inside of the description part here for anyone. But the more well, now, it depends on how you look at it. And it really is. You can look at it as troubling or enlightening. One of the more important pieces, though, that I found of the document, there's three major pieces that I found. One that I just read to you was the description of the reality in which we find ourselves. The second is of the patterning. It's called patterning. It says here, in other words, the techniques of patterning recognizes the fact that since consciousness is the source of all reality, our thoughts have the power to influence the development of reality in time space as it applies to us, if those thoughts can be projected with adequate intensity. However, the more complicated the objective sought, and the more radically it departs from our current reality, the more time the universal hologram will need to reorient our reality sphere to accommodate our desires. Monroe trainers caution against attempting to force the pace of this process because the individual could succeed in dislocating his existing reality with drastic consequences. So, why that's so important when I look back at the We Died in 2012 series, what I was doing at the time was I being prophetic? Was I fulfilling some sort of strange prophecy about dissolving consensus, and the world itself seems to be in a more irrational state right now, right down to the individual? Or, more disturbingly for me as an individual, was I envisioning something so radical and talking about it so openly rather than affecting my outside world? Have I inadvertently dislocated myself from the world that I was supposed to be a part of? And I think in the Mandela Effect community, no one has posed that question yet that I know of. Is it the outer world that is changing, or is it our own inner worlds that have been radically dislocated from the world from which we come from? And I don't think that's ever been asked. And whenever I was doing the original We Died in 2012 series, was I actively engaging in the fictive process, pulling down from the muse, using all the fictive tools that a writer may use, and just doing it in a different format? In a way, was I writing a serial novel at the time, using all those tools and yet using all those metaphysical tools that the muse uses through the writer? And And I wonder because you think of all the really famous artists and writers that I've pointed out throughout history, right? They usually end up insane or worse, right? They don't end up in the best sorts. I'm thinking of that movie from the 80s, Amadeus, and not comparing myself to anything like that, because there are artists that are great and small. They have big impacts and small impacts, and certainly mine is small. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But what if we've entered such a time period because of the Mandela effect, whether it's CERN or whether it's something else or whether it's I don't know what. We've entered a period now that is so malleable that each individual now can suddenly in their own small way become an Ernest Hemingway and can radically change the world that is around them. And yet not know or have the metaphysical training to understand the risk that that poses, or indeed the peril of the artist has always been the risk that they've posed. They've gone too far out. They've gone too far out into the world of the imagination, right? That's why there's copyright. They want to make sure that whatever territory that they've staked claim on, that's theirs. It's all the territory of the imagination is much like real estate. Once you've staked your claim there, that's like your title and deed to that land. That's why Disney, always say, it wants to capture your imagination. It wants to capture your property, your imaginative property, and to ensure that they remain your landlord forever. And that's just a phrase. I'm not specifically attacking Disney, and I'm not specifically attacking any entertainment outfit that's out there to sort of capture your imagination. But for those who refuse to have their imagination captured, I wonder if we do run that risk at times where we find ourselves inadvertently patterning. Indeed, if we are dealing with a holographic universe, we find ourselves inadvertently patterning, and thus we run that risk of dislocation. And is it that it's the Mandela effect that's affected the outside world? Or is it that we've all inadvertently, in our own ways, in some strange cycle that we didn't understand, we pulled down from the muse like a fiction writer or a pulp writer from the earliest 20th century? And we sort of reoriented everything around us. And because of whatever has changed, and made reality as strange where there are art exhibits on the moon, it's raining on the moon is in Earth's atmosphere, UFOs are now a reality. No one can stake that claim. Skeptics are on the run. Could there be lizard people that are shapeshifters? You can no longer laugh at that. Well, sure you could, but you really don't know now, because who's the authority to tell you no? If there are UFOs, are you going to sadly cling to articles that say, well, that's fine that if we have to admit that there's UFOs, that doesn't mean that there's aliens? That's sort of like arguing that there was nothing and then suddenly there was something, right? That's like arguing, like I said yesterday, that that's sort of the vascular system of a goldfish just suddenly popped into being without something imagining it into being first. Also, I think it's Aristotle that talked about the first movement that had to be imagined first. And if it had to be imagined, there has to be an imagination. And if there has to be an imagination, there has to be a being. That is also why I'm not an atheist. But more profound too, once the document got into my hands, and it's one of those old sayings, when the student is ready, the teacher will show up. This document was written in 1983, and it was, as far as I can tell, it is so far the most profound thing that I've ever read in my entire life. It is the most profound thing I've ever read in my entire life. And if you go to page 27 of it, it says, be intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent, non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. And more importantly than that, as disclosure for you, As disclosure for you, you get to K, where it says, arrange to have groups of people in focus 12 state unite their altered consciousness to build holographic patterns around sensitive areas to repulse possible unwanted out of body presences. What that section is saying is that you've got a group of human beings that have left this time space. They've created their own space through their own will, intention, and imagination. And they've somehow created through this patterning that they've named it, which I would call imagination. And through their imagination, through their patterning, they've created this imaginary shield that will repulse anything unwanted around them that's not human or that's not known to them. And truly, it's truly an incredibly simple and beautiful metaphysical document. And it came to me at the perfect time. Things do truly arrive when you're ready for them. The master will arrive when the student is ready. Just really that simple. And you start to think about other channels that will break down things like karate movies or, children's cartoons or mundane sitcoms from 20 years ago. And you find something is so incredibly profound because I've always had this strange idea that if you could probably take one book, and if you read it over and over again as your life changes, you'll be able to find different meanings in that book. And eventually the book, regardless of what the subject is, it will actually become a device that will teach you. Therefore, almost anything you read as you go on in life is ambiguous enough that those words reattach meaning for you at that time, at that given space. But again, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? We're talking about only meaning something in sort of the meta, not in the actual. That was sort of what I was talking about on Twitter earlier this week about the crazy tweet from the NASA official talking about Mars helicopters. You know, try and read that tweet in a vacuum. Because I always say, nothing is in a vacuum. There isn't just a Mandela effect designation, and there's just an ET designation or a UFO designation or an occult designation or an esoteric designation. No, 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 no. None of it is in a vacuum. However, in order to sort of get perspective on something, try sometimes to remove the narrative around a lot of things and actually read the text and develop your own internal narrative. And do that too with holy books as well. Develop your own internal narrative rather than what's been told to you. Oftentimes, you hear people say they don't know the Bible and they've gone to church their entire lives. And when you actually read the Bible, it becomes something of it jolts them. It's shocking to them because they've listened to other people tell them, what it means. And that goes with anything really profound. And the Bible is profound. It's incredibly profound. But I've always wondered that too, is if can you take just one random a book of fiction from, let's say, a medium talent author, right? And really derive incredible meaning from the metaphors that you make up from your own substrata and use that as a mechanism to guide you into untold wisdom in this uncharted territory. And if you refuse to deviate from that book, does the book itself have to take on the burden, that load? Especially if you read the gateway process, that there's definitely a large amount of what's around us has to do with what we think and how we impose it on the world and ourselves. And you also see a beautiful sort of harmony in reality that will only acquiesce so much to to your will, before it begins resisting and you find yourself dislocated. Throughout history, you see all kinds of people who gain some sort of esoteric power or something, and they push it too far and it ends in a destructive way for that person. And it goes back to very, very basic morals and very basic principles, right? Very, very basic things. You can only push things so far before it gets pushed back to you. And again, as I've decided to read this over and over again, I can find different meanings towards it. Every time I read it, like I read it just now, I've found new things every time. So I'm convinced that that can be something of a learning tool, of a life kit. You can add that to your life kit. When you're out in those stormy seas, reread something that gave you meaning at another time in your life and see what it does for you. That's an interesting exercise right there. But anyway, back to the We Died in 2012 series. I didn't realize until I looked back and at all of those things I was talking about. In a lot of ways, it's come true what I was saying. And in a lot of things that I was absolutely guessing, but it was coming from somewhere. And that's the thing that I think people the greatest disservice I think a lot of people have in modernity is that they're sold this idea because it's fiction, it has less value than quote unquote fact. And yet, this idea of facts, they keep crumbling in front of us, especially up to scrutiny. Just like this UFO thing for 70 plus years, governments around the world. And I know Americans want to blame their government, but it's all governments. And I understood why they did. I get it. I totally get why they did it. There would be a collapse of society, the likes of which we can't imagine. So I understand that. I get it. But it was for the longest time considered a fact. And it was a fact that just wasn't our, we're not, we're alone. That's it. It's over. Done. And we can have flights of fancy, but that's it. And yet, not one of those reductive materialists ever thought to think, where do my ideas come from? Well, the big thinkers did, but the mediocre thinkers and the low level thinkers, and those were the ones that were probably the most rabid in their ravaging of someone with an opposing idea. Because that's usually, most people who are that way will react in the most rabid of fashions. Because if deep down there is a central truth. And if you dig down deep enough, it's there. And sometimes it's incredibly painful, and that's why people ignore it. And that's why we find the distortions that we find and the overall harmony of the reality. Because the reality, in fact, will bend towards your will, but only so far. So you need to take care when you do pull down from the muse of fiction. And that is also why lies are so despised, and why they're also so powerful. What is the difference between a lie and a fiction story that we watch, right? It's the context that it's giving. And yet, in that moment when we're watching a film and we're in that moment of suspended disbelief, what do? We believe it's happening. We surrender our emotions. We laugh, we cry, we become terrified. Like that what was that horror movie recently? It wrecked me. Hereditary. Terrified me. Because I'm still willing to suspend it, my disbelief. I'm willing to put it on the shelf for that time. But are they lying to me? Do these people actually exist? No, because it's the context. But what some people do sometimes is they remove that from the normal narrative that this context is embedded, like a crown jewel. You take it with a knife and you cut it out of the crown, and you decide to look at the jewel all by itself, and you realize that perhaps the jewel looks very different whenever it's by itself rather than inside the crown, because the crown represents the narrative that jewel is surrounded by. And if you were to take that knife and you were to take out that jewel, or whatever tool, but I prefer, the idea of a knife because it's blunt what you're doing. Because ultimately what you're doing is you're doing a form of vandalism. At least the people who created the crown, the people who created the narrative, they consider it a form of vandalism, what you're doing. But you take out the jewel and you can see it, if it has any flaws, if it looks different, if it's fake. What does it actually mean to the crown, to the narrative? And it's all these thought ideas, all these thought processes that are important to do. And the reason why you need to do them is because just like working out your body, if you work out your mind with things like this, you start to know where that limit is. And I think a lot of people, they end up daydreaming, they end up patterning and not even knowing they're doing it. And it ends up in a place that they didn't expect. And this document, Analysis for a Gateway Process, read it 100 times. And perhaps then you'll be able to sort of bring in your thoughts tighter and closer to your vest, and soon you'll be able to actually control them as they're transmitted to you. And you won't be a slave of thoughts just coming into your mind like a transmitter and you're wide open. You'll actually be able to hold yourself back from certain things and push away those thoughts. Fortunately, I was prefaced with the power of now, so I had some sort of workout session, so I was able to do that. But a lot of people, they're not willing to do that, or they're just for whatever reasons, they won't do it. But I was fortunate enough to have that kind of training, at least a couple years of that. But I look back on that We Died in 2012 series now, in mid-2019, it was to early 2017, and I realized at the time that I was doing a lot of patterning, and a lot of it seems to be a bit prophecy, but also too, I understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a prophecy for everyone. It could be just me. And the chaos that I think I'm sensing, and the kind of chaos I'm sensing, could be a prophecy I've created for myself because I've accidentally dislocated myself from the harmonic notes that makes up, sort of the human story. So there you go. I just wanted to get that out because I think it's incredibly important, especially now that we really don't have a strong narrative right now. And I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. It's like a new gold rush. And I don't think a lot of people are really seizing upon that opportunity. And perhaps use my template that turned out not that well for me. The We Died in 2012 series, the idea of pulling down from the muse, but do it with discipline and learn from my mistakes. Work on a sort of uh, a fictive idea, but be careful when you do it and take care when you do it. So that's all I have for now, and I appreciate everybody listening. Bye bye.